I never thought a simple inheritance would turn into a legal war that would make national headlines, but when you mess with a civil engineer who knows property law better than most lawyers, you're asking for trouble. My name is Marcus Chen, and this is the story of how I took down Pine Ridge's most tyrannical homeowners association using nothing but historical documents, survey equipment, and a very inconvenient truth about who actually owns the roads they've been charging people to use. It all started 3 months ago when I received the call that changed everything. I was reviewing blueprints for a new bridge project in Seattle when my phone buzzed with an unknown Montana number. The voice on the other end belonged to attorney William Hayes, and his news hit me like a freight train. My great-uncle Thomas Chen, a man I'd only met twice in my life, had passed away and left me his remote cabin in Pine Ridge, Montana. Uncle Thomas had been the black sheep of our family, a reclusive inventor who'd moved to Montana in the 1970s to escape what he called the suffocating conformity of suburban life. The few stories I'd heard painted him as an eccentric genius who'd made his fortune developing water purification systems before disappearing into the wilderness. I remembered him as a kind but mysterious man who always seemed to know more than he was saying. The cabin sat on 40 acres of pristine wilderness, complete with a crystal-clear stream running through the property. Uncle Thomas had built it himself using sustainable materials and off-grid technology that was decades ahead of its time. Solar panels, geothermal heating, and a sophisticated water filtration system made it completely self-sufficient. It was exactly the kind of retreat I'd been dreaming about as an escape from the corporate engineering world. My first visit to Pine Ridge should have been a peaceful retreat to assess my inheritance, but instead, I drove straight into a nightmare. The community had grown around Uncle Thomas's property over the decades, transforming from a handful of cabins into an upscale development of luxury homes worth millions. At the center of this transformation was the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, ruled with an iron fist by its president, Miranda Blackwood. Miranda was everything you'd expect from a power-hungry HOA dictator. Perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and the kind of condescending smile that made you want to check your wallet afterward. She drove a pristine white Range Rover with personalized license plates reading PRPRTRE and treated the entire community like her personal kingdom. I first encountered Miranda on a crisp October morning as I was photographing the cabin's unique architectural features for insurance purposes. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, clipboard in hand, wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her heels clicked against the wooden deck like a countdown timer as she approached. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that could freeze water. "I don't recall authorizing any photography in this community. All exterior modifications and documentation must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee." She looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. I set down my camera and pulled out the property deed Hayes had given me. "I'm Marcus Chen, Thomas Chen's great-nephew. I inherited this property, so I'm just documenting what's here." Her expression shifted from annoyance to calculation in an instant, like a predator sizing up new prey. "Chen," she repeated, tapping her manicured nails against her clipboard. "I don't see that name on our current homeowners association registry. This property will need to be brought into compliance with all current community standards before any occupancy can be approved." The way she emphasized compliance made it sound like a threat. Over the next hour, Miranda proceeded to issue 17 separate violation notices for everything from the cabin's non-conforming earth tone color scheme to the unauthorized solar panel installation that had been powering the property for 40 years. Each violation came with a fine ranging from $200 to $1,500, plus mandatory architectural review fees. The solar panels will need to be removed or relocated to comply with our aesthetic guidelines, she informed me while photographing every inch of the property. The natural wood siding must be painted in one of our 12 approved colors, all of which happen to be variations of beige, and this stream She gestured dismissively at the crystal-clear water that had been flowing through the property since before humans arrived. Creates moisture issues that could affect neighboring property values. The absurdity of her demands was matched only by their brazen illegality. You can't force someone to paint over natural wood that's been standing for 50 years. And you certainly can't demand they divert a natural stream. But Miranda seemed completely confident in her authority, as if she'd never been challenged before. You have 30 days to submit compliance plans for all violations, she continued, handing me a thick packet of forms. Failure to comply will result in daily fines and potential legal action to force sale of the property. Her smile never wavered as she delivered this ultimatum. That evening, I sat in Uncle Thomas's remarkably well-preserved cabin, surrounded by his books, inventions, and meticulous records. The man had been a pack rat when it came to documentation, saving everything from utility bills to newspaper clippings. As I sorted through decades of paperwork, I began to understand why he'd been so careful about keeping records. In a fireproof filing cabinet, I discovered a folder labeled Property Rights and Legal Protections that contained dozens of documents dating back to the 1960s. The most interesting was a surveyor's report from 1972 that showed the original property boundaries before Pine Ridge development began. According to this survey, Uncle Thomas's 40 acres extended much further than I'd realized, including several areas that were now considered part of the community's common spaces, but the real bombshell was buried in a manila envelope marked for emergency use only. Inside was a copy of the original 1968 deed that granted Thomas Chen not just ownership of his 40 acres, but also permanent easement rights over all access roads serving the Pine Ridge area. The developer had needed to cross Uncle Thomas's property to build the main access road, and in exchange for that easement, they'd granted him perpetual rights to control and maintain all community roads. The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. Every resident of Pine Ridge, including Miranda Blackwood herself, was using roads that my great-uncle technically owned and maintained. The HOA had been collecting road maintenance fees for decades, but they had no legal authority to do so. Uncle Thomas had been the real owner of Pine Ridge's entire transportation infrastructure. I spent the next week diving deeper into the property records, driving to the county courthouse and pulling every document related to Pine Ridge's development. The story that emerged was fascinating and infuriating in equal measure. The original developer had cut corners and failed to properly transfer road ownership to the county or establish a legitimate maintenance district. When the development changed hands multiple times over the years, the paperwork had gotten increasingly muddled. Uncle Thomas had clearly known about this situation but had chosen not to make waves. His personal notes, written in precise engineering handwriting, showed he'd been quietly maintaining the roads out of his own pocket for decades, while the HOA collected fees from residents for services they weren't actually providing. He'd been subsidizing the entire community's infrastructure, while Miranda and her predecessors took credit and lined their pockets. The more I researched, the more I understood why Uncle Thomas had been so meticulous about documentation. He'd been building a legal case for 50 years, collecting evidence of every overreach and abuse of power by the various HOA boards. His files contained photographs of illegal property modifications, records of fraudulent fee collections, and correspondence showing how the HOA had systematically bullied residents into compliance with rules they had no authority to enforce. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to fight back. But I wanted to do it the right way. Instead of immediately confronting Miranda, I quietly hired the best property law attorney in Montana, a sharp woman named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in HOA disputes. When I showed her Uncle Thomas's documentation, her eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "This is incredible," she said, spreading the surveys and deeds across her conference table. "Your great-uncle essentially owns the entire community's road system. The HOA has been operating under false pretenses for decades. We could shut down their whole operation tomorrow if we wanted to. But shutting them down immediately wasn't what I had in mind. If Miranda wanted to play games with property rights and community standards, I was going to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. We developed a strategy that would expose the HOA's illegal activities while protecting the innocent residents who'd been unknowingly paying fraudulent fees for years. First, I formally notified the county that I was exercising my rights as the legitimate road maintenance authority for Pine Ridge. This required filing paperwork with the Transportation Department and establishing myself as the official entity responsible for road upkeep and access control. The county officials were confused at first, but the documentation was ironclad. Next, I had professional surveyors mark the exact boundaries of my road easement, which included not just the paved surfaces but also the drainage ditches, utility corridors, and landscaped areas on either side. Bright orange survey stakes appeared overnight throughout Pine Ridge, marking territory that most residents had assumed belonged to the HOA. The third phase of my plan was the most satisfying. I sent certified letters to every household in Pine Ridge, informing them that effective immediately, all road maintenance fees should be paid to Chen Property Management rather than the HOA. I included copies of the historical documents proving my legal authority and offered to reduce their monthly fees by 60%, since I wouldn't need to skim money for administrative overhead like Miranda had been doing. Miranda's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. She showed up at my cabin at 7 in the morning, pounding on the door like she was trying to break it down. When I opened it, she was practically vibrating with rage. Her perfect hair slightly disheveled and her face red with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she screamed, waving one of my letters in the air. "You can't just declare yourself the road authority. I've been managing these roads for 8 years. The Homeowners Association has legitimate authority over all community infrastructure." I invited her in for coffee, but she refused, preferring to conduct her tantrum on the front porch where half the neighborhood could hear. "Show me your documentation," I said calmly. "I've shown you mine. Where are the deeds, surveys, and legal instruments that establish HOA authority over these roads?" The question caught her completely off guard. In 8 years of bullying residents into compliance, apparently no one had ever asked her to prove her authority. She sputtered for several minutes about community standards and property values before storming off, promising to contact my lawyers immediately. Over the next few days, I watched Pine Ridge transform into a battleground. Residents were confused and divided, unsure whether to pay their road fees to me or continue supporting the HOA. Some neighbors stopped by to ask questions, and I was happy to show them the historical documents and explain how they'd been unknowingly subsidizing Miranda's power trip for years. The most interesting conversations were with the older residents who remembered Uncle Thomas and the early days of Pine Ridge development. Eleanor Hoffman, an 80-year-old widow who'd lived there since 1975, confirmed many details from Uncle Thomas's records. Tom was always fixing potholes and clearing storm drains, she told me, over tea in her kitchen. Miranda acts like she invented road maintenance, but Tom was out there with his pickup truck and a shovel every time we had bad weather. He never asked for a penny, just said it was his responsibility as a neighbor. Eleanor also shared stories about Miranda's rise to power and the systematic way she'd driven out anyone who questioned her authority. "The Hendersons used to live in the blue house by the creek," she said sadly. "Nice family. 3 young children. Miranda fined them into bankruptcy over some nonsense about their garden violating the landscape code. They lost their home and had to move back east to live with relatives." These stories confirmed what I'd suspected from Uncle Thomas's documentation. Miranda hadn't just been collecting fraudulent fees, she'd been using her fabricated authority to destroy lives and break up families. The woman was a sociopath who'd found the perfect system to feed her need for control and dominance. Miranda's legal response came exactly 1 week later, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole situation. The lawsuit claimed I was interfering with legitimate HOA operations and demanded immediate cessation of all road maintenance activities. It also sought damages for disruption of community harmony and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Reading through the filing with Sarah Martinez was almost comical. Miranda's lawyers had clearly done minimal research and were operating under the assumption that HOAs always have legitimate authority over community infrastructure. They'd filed a standard template lawsuit without bothering to investigate the underlying property rights. "This is going to be fun," Sarah said with a grin. "They're essentially arguing that their client has authority to collect fees for maintaining roads she doesn't own. It's like suing someone for refusing to pay rent on their own house." Our response was swift and devastating. We filed a countersuit that not only defended my road maintenance rights but also sought damages for decades of fraudulent fee collection, harassment of residents, and violation of property rights. We demanded a full accounting of every dollar the HOA had collected in road fees, plus interest and penalties for the illegal appropriation of funds. But the real surprise came when we subpoenaed Miranda's personal financial records as part of the discovery process. What we found was a web of financial manipulation that made her road fee scam look like petty theft. She'd been using her position as HOA president to funnel community funds into her personal accounts through a series of shell companies providing consulting services and administrative support. The woman had stolen over $400,000 from her neighbors over 8 years, using the money to fund her luxury lifestyle while threatening residents with fines and foreclosure if they couldn't afford her fraudulent fees. She'd literally been extorting money from families to pay for her Range Rover and designer wardrobe. As news of the financial fraud spread through Pine Ridge, Miranda's support evaporated overnight. Residents who'd been intimidated into silence for years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of harassment, illegal fines, and threats. The woman who'd terrorized the community for nearly a decade was finally being exposed as the criminal she'd always been. The legal proceedings moved quickly once the evidence was presented. Miranda's lawyers abandoned her case when they realized they were defending someone who'd been systematically defrauding her clients for years. Without legal representation, she tried to represent herself in court, which was painful to watch and utterly ineffective. Judge Patricia Sullivan was not impressed with Miranda's performance or her excuses. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said during the final hearing, "you have systematically abused your position of trust to steal money from your neighbors. You have harassed and intimidated residents who questioned your authority. Most seriously, you have collected fees for services you had no legal right to provide." The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating. Miranda was ordered to pay full restitution to every resident who'd been charged illegal road fees, plus interest and penalties totaling over $600,000. She was also banned from serving in any HOA leadership position and required to undergo financial counseling and community service. But the most satisfying part of the judgment was the section dealing with ongoing road maintenance. The court officially recognized my authority as the legitimate road maintenance entity for Pine Ridge and ordered the dissolution of the existing HOA board. Residents would have the option to form a new, democratically elected association or continue with private road maintenance under my management. The transformation of Pine Ridge after Miranda's departure was remarkable to witness. Without her reign of terror, neighbors began talking to each other again, sharing ideas and working together to improve their community. Property values actually increased once buyers realized they wouldn't have to deal with an abusive HOA and fraudulent fees. I chose to reduce road maintenance fees to the absolute minimum needed for actual upkeep, returning thousands of dollars annually to each household. The money Miranda had been skimming went back into legitimate improvements like better drainage, upgraded lighting, and emergency snow removal equipment. The community voted to establish a new residents' association with rotating leadership and transparent financial management. Eleanor Hoffman was elected as the first president, bringing decades of institutional knowledge and a commitment to treating neighbors with respect rather than suspicion. As for Miranda, the financial judgment forced her to sell her mansion and luxury vehicles to pay restitution to the residents she'd defrauded. She moved out of Pine Ridge in disgrace, driving away in a 10-year-old Honda with all her belongings crammed into the back seat. The woman who'd once terrorized an entire community with threats and fines slunk away like the coward she'd always been underneath her designer facade. 6 months later, I was sitting on Uncle Thomas's deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The stream babbled peacefully through the property, just as it had for thousands of years before humans arrived, and would continue long after we were gone. The cabin's solar panels hummed quietly, powering the sustainable systems my great-uncle had installed decades before green technology became mainstream. My phone buzzed with a text message from Eleanor Monthly Residents meeting tonight at 7. We're discussing the community garden project and the new playground equipment. Hope you can make it. The contrast between her inclusive leadership style and Miranda's authoritarian approach couldn't have been more stark. I'd kept Uncle Thomas's cabin as my weekend retreat, but it had become much more than that. It was a reminder that standing up to bullies and fighting for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. My great-uncle had spent 50 years quietly documenting injustice and preparing for the day when someone would need to fight back. I was honored to be the one who finally used his careful preparation to restore justice to Pine Ridge. The legal victory had also launched my new career as a property rights consultant, helping other communities deal with abusive HOAs and fraudulent management companies. The Pine Ridge case had attracted national attention, and I was getting calls from homeowners across the country who were facing similar situations. Each case was different, but the patterns were depressingly similar: power-hungry individuals using fabricated authority to intimidate and defraud their neighbors, counting on people's ignorance of property law and fear of legal costs to maintain their control. What they didn't count on was someone with the knowledge, resources, and determination to fight back effectively. As I watched the stars emerge in the Montana sky, I thought about Uncle Thomas and the legacy he'd left behind. He could have used his documentation to destroy the fraudulent HOA decades earlier, but he'd chosen patience and preparation instead. He'd known that someday, someone would need the tools he was carefully preserving, and he'd made sure those tools would be available when the time came. The cabin would remain in the Chen family for generations to come, a testament to the power of preparation, patience, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And if another Miranda Blackwood ever tried to terrorize Pine Ridge again, she'd find that Uncle Thomas's legacy included more than just historical documents and property rights. It included a community that had learned the difference between legitimate authority and manufactured power, and wasn't afraid to defend itself against those who would abuse their trust. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's making sure the bullies can never hurt anyone else again. Miranda Blackwood learned that lesson the hard way, and Pine Ridge became a better place because someone finally had the courage and knowledge to hold her accountable for her crimes.